Good evening, everyone. I will do my usual sound check. Can you hear me at the back? No. Okay. I'm going to hold it closer. Is that better? Hurrah. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Swainson, and I'm a trustee of Litfest. And Litfest, together with Lancaster University and 7 departments, has, since 2022, organised the Lancaster Environment Lecture. The first lecture was given by Dr. Vandana Shiva. Last year's was given by George Monbiot, and I'm delighted that this year's will be given by Caroline Lucas, who has been a shining example to many of us for a very long time. I'm going to say one other thing right now before I hand over to Professor Andrew Schofield, Vice-Chancellor of the University, and that is to say we are extremely glad to be working in collaboration with the University, and we are extremely grateful to the National Lottery Heritage Fund for their support for Litfest and both our history and our environment strands, and they are supporting this lecture tonight. I'll have more to say at the end, but right now, please welcome, first of all, Professor Andrew Schofield.
Thank you very much. My job is, on behalf of Lancaster University, to welcome not just Litfest, not just Caroline Lucas, our distinguished speaker, but all of you coming to attend, and there are a number of people online as well. I won't stand long between you and what you're really here for, which is to hear from one of the most distinguished of our MPs who has championed sustainability for many years and is talking in more general terms about her most recent book and other things. But I will say that one of the reasons Lancaster is so pleased to be involved both in Litfest but also in environmental things is it's been core to our campus and to activity that we do for many years. This is our 60th birthday this year as a university, and over those 60 years, many things have happened and developed, part of which is the growing reputation of this university, its position in the league tables improving year on year, and the generations now of students who've studied here and gone on to change the world in their own right. But we also represent at Lancaster University scientists, social scientists, people from the arts and humanities who have, in their research, changed the world in different areas, and sustainability has been at the core of that. Our Lancaster Environment Centre, for example, is one of the largest groupings of scientists, both natural scientists and social scientists, doing work on sustainability in all its forms. We've got engineers working on new forms of energy generation, and we've got colleagues working on the politics and indeed the law associated with sustainability. So that's been a core part of our endeavour, and I should mention too places like the Pentland Centre for Sustainable Business, thinking through what sustainability means for small businesses and large. So lots of research work going on in this place. But also the other thing that we've tried to do is to not just talk and research, is to change ourselves, and that's very much at the instigation of our vibrant student body, always certainly holding my feet to the fire in matters of sustainability and indeed many other things, you won't be surprised to hear. And in terms of trying to practice what we preach, you will have seen for over a decade we've had the wind turbine turning over the M6, which generates 15% of the university's electricity. But more recently than that, we're putting a photovoltaic farm which will kind of complete that picture. We'd like to upgrade the wind turbine too, if we possibly could. But also very recently got funding to change all of our current gas heating to electrical heat pumps, electrically powered heat pumps that will turn the campus yet more green. And so we want to aspire to be the most green campus university we can be. And that is captured in our commitment to carbon neutrality, which we declared through the climate emergency in 2020 to be carbon neutral by 2035 and scope 1 and 2 carbon neutral by 2030. Those challenges are not insignificant for a university that is global in its footprint, but we also are responding to the issues around travel by putting overseas activity and teaching students so they don't have to always travel to Lancaster to get the benefit of a Lancaster education. And that is evident in just the number of students that we have, 17,000 who are here, but there are a further 8,000 now that study for Lancaster degrees, and they do so in their home countries, whether that's China or Malaysia, Ghana in West Africa, Germany, and from next year in Indonesia. So, lots that we're doing. We could be yet doing more, and I certainly acknowledge that. But it's in events like this that we get to hear what sort of things we should be doing and what sort of world we might hope to create in the future. And so thank you very much indeed for coming to this. And I'm now going to ask my colleague, Professor Ed Simpson, who's Executive Dean for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, who is going to come and introduce our distinguished speaker. So over to you, Ed. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. That's a nod required. Yes, good, because I've got a mic on here. So, welcome to the university. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I'm also a keen proponent of the role of arts, humanities and social science in public life and to address the big issues of our time. I'm also very proud to partner with Bill and Litfest through these events and other series of lectures that we've organised over the course of the year. But I'm standing here now to introduce Caroline Lucas MP as our speaker for the evening. As you know, Caroline is MP for Brighton Pavilion and the UK's first Green Party MP. Caroline's been in Parliament since 2010 and has served as the leader of the Green Party twice. And was also member of the European Parliament for 10 years, and has a PhD in English literature, which was squeezed in somewhere as well. Caroline will be known to many of you as a source of inspiration, as someone who has been very active in national politics, but also somebody who has agitated, has gone against the grain, has made different points of view be heard on a national stage. Someone who has gone about her role in public life with a great deal of care and attention to inequality, injustice, and has raised many of those sorts of issues in the Parliament and now on a national stage. But this evening, she's going to ask something else of you. And she's going to ask you to think, which is even harder, perhaps. So at the end of the lecture, Caroline and I are going to have a discussion about what she said and about her book, which has been published, and then we're going to open the floor for a Q&A. So, Caroline, it's with great pleasure I'd invite you to take the lection and to deliver the third Lancaster Environment Lecture, and warm welcome to Lancaster University. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Happy birthday, Lancaster University, 60 years, and thank you to all of you for coming out this evening. I am hugely honoured to have been asked to give the third Lancaster Environment Lecture and to follow in the footsteps of giants like George Monbiot and Vandana Shiva. Now, you might be wondering, with some legitimacy, why a lecture on the environment has been given the title, Another England is Possible. And the case that I want to make tonight is that we can't separate the accelerating destruction of the natural world from the failing democratic structures which we might have expected to prevent it. And neither can we understand the accelerating destruction of the natural world without a deeper reflection on the place of nature in what I would call the broader English social and cultural landscape. In other words, the environment crisis, I think, reflects both a democratic crisis and a deeper social and cultural one as well. So I'm going to start by reflecting a little bit on what the nature is of that democratic crisis. I think it's clear that we have an increasingly populist government that has deliberately set out to weaken the very institutions that define a liberal democracy. Now, Boris Johnson, for example, was famously a law-breaking, parliament-proroguing, office-abusing Prime Minister with only a very casual relationship to the truth. But while his illegal prorogation of Parliament was perhaps the most egregious example of his excesses, it has hardly been an isolated incident. The attacks on our democratic institutions have come thick and fast under this government. From ministers taking action against the courts to shrink their ability to hold the ruling party to account, to curbing citizens' rights to protest, introducing a new act which will make it harder for people to vote, imposing new rules that would gag whistleblowers and sharply restrict the freedom of the press. The dangers of the so-called good chaps approach to government, which assumed that binding rules aren't needed because, of course, MPs are honourable and they will always act in the public interest. The dangers of that good chaps approach, which just assumes all of that, I think has been tested to its limits and far beyond. Without a written constitution, without any robust system to hold ministers to account, I think the foundations of British democracy have been shown to be very vulnerable indeed. I think it's very clear that in many respects, our political institutions are broken. Not just broken in the populist abuse of sovereignty, but, for example, in the archaic and undemocratic first-past-the-post voting system, an over-centralised governance system, an unelected House of Lords, although I do have to say in parenthesis, they're doing a bloody sight better than the House of Commons right now in terms of challenging the government, but nonetheless, I'd rather they weren't unelected. And, of course, the vast networks of patronage on which our whole political system is built. So there's that aspect of the democratic crisis, but I would also argue that it's a crisis about nationalism and identity as well. And to give you a flavour of what I mean, take the way the referendum on the EU was handled. The fact that England and Wales voted to leave and Scotland and Northern Ireland to stay, I think has put incredible strain on the myth that the UK is an equal partnership of four nations. Support for independence remains solid in Scotland. The chances of Irish reunification are growing on the island of Ireland, and we've seen, of course, with the rise of Sinn Féin and the fact that we now have a First Minister in Northern Ireland from Sinn Féin who has said that she's expecting that there could well be that referendum on reunifying the island of Ireland before 2030. And then even in Wales, we've got an independent commission on the constitutional future of Wales, which has put some radical options into play, including full independence. So ironically then, although Brexit was framed as being about defending the integrity and the sovereignty of the UK, I believe it's actually not at all certain that the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will continue in that form for very much longer. It is not inconceivable, in other words, that in a generation, Brexit could be followed by Sexit, Nexit, and Wexit. So what does all of that mean for England? Will it be a smaller, diminished version of what we have now? Will imperial nostalgia and exceptionalism continue to shape its sense of itself? Or could it just become a genuine democracy? Could it become confident in itself and inclusive? And that conversation, those questions, as far as I can see, are hardly being discussed anywhere at all. I don't think anyone in England is very much thinking about these questions, and yet I would argue it is time that we did. Because if those questions were urgent on Brexit Day, I'd say they're even more urgent today. Not only as xenophobic nationalism rises across Europe and also here at home, but also as the global nature and climate emergencies, which will define this age, continue to spiral rapidly out of control. So in the rest of my talk this evening, I'm going to try and focus on that interplay between our broken politics and our broken natural world. And my starting point is this question. As a nation that prides itself on its love of the countryside, on the love of nature, why is it that we have become one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world? For all our supposed love of nature, specifically of the English countryside, the governments we've elected for generations now, Conservative and Labour, have been allowed to preside over its destruction. And indeed, this has happened to an extent that is almost unprecedented in any other comparable country. There was a recent study by the Swedish Academy of Sciences examining biodiversity, well-being, and nature connectedness in 14 countries. Biodiversity, well-being, and nature connectedness, and the UK came bottom in all 3 of those out of 14 countries. And let's be very clear, that was not just a matter of population density, for example, or that played a part. It was also a political choice, one that reflects the gross inequalities in our society and the way that power is concentrated in the hands of the wealthy who use their influence to bypass our creaking democratic structures. And so maybe it's no surprise then that as a result, half of England's ancient woodland has gone in the last century due to conifer plantations, overgrazing, the spread of invasive species. We've also lost, although I don't like that word, let's be honest, we have also destroyed 80% of our heathland, 85% of our salt marshes, 97% of our wildflower meadows, and with them we have driven to extinction hundreds of species of plants and animals. Development for housing, transport, mineral extraction and other industries has eaten up vast tracts of the countryside, while industrial agriculture and increases in traffic have diminished much of what remains. As a result, there are 40 million fewer wild birds than there were just 50 years ago. In my lifetime alone, the total biodiversity in England has been slashed by a half. A disaster so extreme it is, frankly, pretty hard to contemplate. Imagine if we'd lost half of our population, or half of England was swallowed by the sea, or half of the country's wealth was wasted. And yet we've sacrificed half of our natural inheritance without, it seems, a second thought. So tonight I want to explore how we can explain why England, a nation so in love with the countryside, has allowed its natural world to be so badly harmed. How have we allowed so many people to be cut off from what remains? And how can a reappraisal of the politics of England help to reverse both of those trends? I think a good starting point is ownership of land, because England has one of the most grotesquely unequal land ownership structures in the Western world, and also certainly one of the most opaque. Painstaking research by land campaigner Guy Shrubsole has uncovered the shocking calculation that half of England is owned by less than 1% of its population. That equates to around 25,000 landowners, typically members of the aristocracy and corporations. And actually, it's even worse than that, because the Land Registry, which is the public body that is meant to be responsible for keeping a database of land and property in England and Wales, covers only around 83% of the land. What, you may ask, as I did, has happened to the other 17%? Well, apparently that's information that even members of Parliament can't get hold of. But this staggering concentration of vast tracts of land in the hands of just a very few landowners is deeply problematic for a range of reasons. Not only because it stops the vast majority from having a fair stake in the country, but because of the huge power that goes with it. Large landowners have a major influence over our food and environment policies. Just one example that I've been fighting in Parliament for a very long time now is on pesticides. We have overwhelming evidence, there is no doubt about it, that the pesticides that we are spraying all over our land has catastrophic impacts on our wildlife, and quite possibly for human health as well. Yet landowners have effectively blocked more ambitious controls on those pesticides. And the result is that poisonous emissions that we probably wouldn't tolerate for one moment from the waste pipe of a factory are somehow accepted as unavoidable when they come from the spray nozzles of a tractor. And at the heart of these neo-feudal power dynamics lies the disproportionate political influence of landowners as well. You know, landowners sprout up so frequently on government committees, in the cabinet, or on the boards of major companies that it feels as natural as the cycle of the seasons. And the whole system is held together by a lingering sense of deference towards those born to land and wealth and titles. Now, I don't doubt that there are some with a genuine desire to act as good stewards and custodians of their land. But to the extent that abuses of power do happen, they really are failures of government, failures to regulate. And if we as a society give landowners excessive power and status, we can hardly be surprised when they're misused. So if we're serious about creating a greener and more pleasant land, then I think we have to get serious about breaking the link between land and political power. For example, we could start with the creation of a comprehensive land register that was open to all. And if we did that, we would know who owns what, with who in that context, meaning actual individuals or firms, not shadowy shell companies in Jersey or the British Virgin Islands. Right now, it's almost impossible to find out who owns what, and it costs you £3 every time you ask. And it's been calculated it would probably cost you about £70 million to work out who owns what in England. Secondly, reform of the House of Lords would mean that landed interests aren't given a privileged position in the legislature. Reform of party funding would push back against the influence of the powerful and the wealthy on our democracy. How often do we hear about people giving vast donations to the Tory party, and it is usually the Tory party, and then before you know it, before you've blinked, there they are in the House of Lords. Totally coincidental, of course. A land value tax could also play an important role in tackling the vast windfall profits that come from the development of land. So a piece of land is worth a certain amount in its undeveloped state. Suddenly, if someone puts a railway station next to it, it massively increases in value, but the person whose land it is has done nothing to actually enhance the value of that land. This is something that is so clear that it's been sort of in the shadows of policymaking for years, but the fact that such a simple and fair measure has not been introduced is, I think, itself a casebook example of landowners' ability to block reform. And that brings me to my second point, which is about people's connectedness with the natural world. Because policy measures like these around land ownership, I think, could also dramatically increase the chances of securing more ambitious policies on widening access to land. Because restrictions on public access to land is another peculiarly English phenomenon, in spite of the fact that England actually has a really rich history of land reform movements that is barely even spoken of, probably not even remembered. I want to take, by way of example, and this is a bit of a risk because I'm asking you a question, and if it doesn't work, my point won't be made. But anyway, the Charter of the Forest, 1217. Can I ask, by a show of hands, how many people in the room have heard of the Charter of the Forest from 1217? Oh, well, I was about to say, oh, good, it's not good. But anyway, it does make my point because there's about half a dozen. Okay, by contrast, hands up if you've heard of the 1215 Magna Carta. Yes, good, phew. So, the point that I'm making is that just about all of us are taught about the Magna Carta, which guaranteed our political liberties. That was 1215. Just 2 years later, 1217, came the Charter of the Forest, which hardly any of us know about at all. I didn't know about it until very recently. We're certainly not taught about it. And that charter enshrined our right to the environment and to environmental resources. For hundreds of years, it had to be read out in every church in England 4 times a year. And it contained some of the most radical commitments on access rights to the commons that have ever been agreed. And yet how quickly it seems to have disappeared from our collective national consciousness. Yet even, of course, in the 754 years it was in place, because it was only formally repealed in 1971, even in those 754 years, I have to confess, yes, it was subject to relentless attack from those in power. Henry VIII, for example, confiscated 10 million acres and handed them out to his favourites, the descendants of whom still possess hundreds of thousands of acres today. In the 18th and 19th centuries, we had the Enclosure Acts, another massive land grab by parliamentarians on vast tracts of commons that had been governed collectively for centuries. And the legacy of these attacks can still be felt in the lack of connection to nature that so many people in England have to this day. People want to be able to go out to the countryside and enjoy it, but many still feel unwelcome, or they worry that they'll be challenged for being in the wrong place. There is no right to roam over a staggering 92% of England, and a massive 97% of our rivers are off limits as well. And we've come to accept that as somehow normal. But when you look at other comparable European countries, or even just look as close as Scotland, where since 2003 they have had a comprehensive right to roam enshrined in legislation, when you compare us to those other countries, it becomes clear the extent to which we have been literally dispossessed of access to the land. Today, 1 in 5 people in England struggle to access quality green space of any kind, not just private gardens, but also public parks or countryside. And that number is even worse for people on low incomes or from ethnic minority communities, reflecting the wider inequalities that still bedevil England. So for many people, there is simply no practical way to enjoy green space. So perhaps it's no surprise that people in England have become so disconnected from the natural world. You might know that famous calculation that apparently prisoners now spend more time in the open air than most of our young people. And this is a shift with disastrous consequences, not only for our mental and physical health, and the evidence of that is overwhelming, but also, I would argue, for the state of the natural world itself. Because our lack of connection to nature, I think, has also limited our ability to care for it. As the writer Nick Hayes argues, and he's a writer, you might know him, writes beautifully and draws beautifully about trespass and walking in places where perhaps you're not meant to be, according to the signposts. But as he argues, when they took away our rights to access the land, they took away our ability to protect it. And it's a vicious circle, because one of the points made by another writer, the US writer Richard Louv, is that the more distanced we become from nature, the less likely we are to value it, which accelerates not only the loss of nature itself, but also our further alienation from it. And as Richard Louv concludes, we cannot protect something that we don't love, we can't love what we don't know, and we can't know what we don't see or hear or sense. I believe that a legal and comprehensive right to roam, along the lines of the one that they've had in Scotland for over 20 years, I believe that right could start to change all of this, and it's something that I've been working on in Parliament with, for example, a private member's bill trying to bring that in. But as well as access to nature, we also need to foster an understanding of the natural world that has been lost in many respects from our society. A recent study in the UK found that half of children couldn't identify even the most common plants, whether brambles or bluebells or stinging nettles. Now, this is an era where children growing up learn about apps and algorithms, they learn about chatbots and coding, and I don't want to detract from the importance of learning any of that. But it feels to me that if we're to stand a hope of addressing the nature crisis in this country, we can't continue to let our kids learn everything about the cyber world and next to nothing about the natural world which surrounds them. Not least because addressing the environment and climate crisis will require a generation of scientists armed with the knowledge to do so. So education is a really vital piece of the solution, and that's why I've campaigned alongside the campaigner Mary Colwell for the government to introduce a new GCSE in natural history. And of the things that I'm most proud of as I look back on 14 years in Parliament, at least at the moment, the government has agreed, I agreed in 2022, that they would bring in this new GCSE in natural history. And why that's so important, I would argue, is that it's a kind of degree, a kind of qualification that will enable kids to get the soil under their fingertips. It's learning about the individual fauna and flora. So where biology focuses on the systems of life and how life works, natural history is the study of life itself, the plants, animals, fungi, and all that makes up our natural world. That ability to be able to name it and to know it and feel familiar and intimate with it, I think is going to be something that is really transformative. Young people will gain the skills of the naturalist, learning how to observe, to record, to monitor, to name, and to understand. And those are skills that will not only enhance and enrich their own lives, I think, but also be vitally necessary to our society as a whole. As the leading environmental economist, Professor Sapatha Dasgupta, wrote in a Treasury-commissioned report of 2021, if we care about our common future and the common future of our descendants, we should all, in part, be naturalists. The more we reflect, I think, on the importance of the natural world to our physical and mental well-being, the more we see how our society fails to give us equal chances to engage with it, or, as I've argued, to help to restore it. As a result, the air we breathe is polluted, bringing thousands of people to an early death and afflicting the health of millions. The water we drink is increasingly contaminated with microplastics and complex chemicals, as well as sewage, and we have little idea of the long-term consequences. And governments allow this to happen, at least in part, I'd argue, because no one has a legal right to clean air and clean water, or a legal right to live in a world in which nature is protected now and for the future. And as a result, firms that stand to make profits from damaging the environment are all too often simply allowed to get away with it. Even supposedly regulated businesses like water companies who deliberately plan to dump raw sewage in rivers and seas because it's cheaper to pay the fines than it is to upgrade the Victorian infrastructure and the proper treatment facilities that we need. Yet this has happened, and it continues to happen, in a country where millions join the National Trust, or the County Wildlife Trusts, the RSPB, the Woodland Trusts, and a dozen more conservation organisations, where millions more tune in to programmes like Springwatch, and where David Attenborough has more moral authority than every MP in government rolled together. So the English do quite clearly have a deep and abiding love of nature, and yet somehow this doesn't save it from being destroyed. So how then do we explain this glaring contradiction? I've talked about land ownership, I've talked about the lack of access to land, but I want to talk about a third issue, and that is that I think there's something about the English concept of nature where we view it as something separate from ourselves and from our own lives. We view it as a beautiful, bucolic realm that we might admire through a train window or we might watch on television. We turn it into a postcard or a photo or a post on social media or a venue for recreation, a temporary respite from the real world, not an essential and indivisible part of ourselves. And in my book, I argue that this, in fact, is not a phenomenon unique to our era. It's a facet of our culture that is tangible, for example, in English literature, going back as far as the 18th century and probably far before that as well. And I was going to illustrate that by just comparing two poems, if you'd bear with me while I do. Consider this from one of the foremost English poets of the 18th century, William Cowper. It's an excerpt from his poem, The Poplar Field, from 1784, and the ooze he refers to in the poem is the River Ouse. And he writes, "The poplars are felled, farewell to the shade and the whispering sound of the cool colonnade. The winds play no longer and sing in the leaves, nor ooze on his bosom their image receives. 12 years have elapsed since I last took a view of my favourite field and the bank where they grew. And now in the grass, behold, they are laid, and the tree is my seat that once lent me a shade. Now his sense of regret and sorrow does ring through, but at the same time, it's almost like there's a kind of perverse satisfaction because the loss of the tree, which is now a log that he can sit on, allows him to muse on the mutability of life and the passage of time. And so he goes on, my fugitive years are all hasting away, and I must ere long lie as lowly as they, with a turf on my breast and a stone at my head, ere another such grove shall arise in its stead. So in that poem, I think you get a bit of a sense that for Cooper, nature exists to serve human needs and purposes, just like the poplars that have been cut down. Nature is picturesque, but viewed from a distance and with a sense of melancholy and nostalgia. And it's a theme running through English literature about the countryside, mourning what has gone, rather more than fighting to protect what is left. But I'd argue that resigned nostalgia is an indulgence we cannot afford at a time of global ecological catastrophe. Now, Cooper was writing about the River Ouse that runs from Northamptonshire to the sea at King's Lynn. And as with almost every other river in England, it's now polluted by algae blooms as a result of everything from agricultural runoffs to raw sewage. In almost every case, no action is taken to tackle the level of pollution because it is apparently technically infeasible or disproportionately expensive or unreasonably burdensome. For example, reducing the profitability of the farms which are responsible for the high levels of pollution from pesticides and fertilizers, or the privatized water companies who regularly release the raw sewage into our river. Meanwhile, along the banks of the Ouse and right across England, the poplars that Cooper describes are in retreat, their habitats destroyed for drainage or new housing or gravel extraction. And as a result, there are only 7,000 black poplars left, making it England's most endangered native tree. But if literature shows us how nature has been turned into something distant and separate from humanity, it also offers us hints of an alternative relationship. And for the writer who, I think, points the way forward on that, let's turn to another English writer from that time, John Clare. As an agricultural labourer with an intimate knowledge of the realities of rural life, he's officially credited with over 100 first county records of birds and plants that have been gleaned from his work. And the way he writes, to quote his biographer, Professor Jonathan Bate, is not a description of dwelling with the earth, not a disengaged thinking about it, but an experiencing of it. The father of modern nature writing, Richard Mabey, describes John Clare's ability to, and I quote, trace out the mutual dependence of things, not just out in the world, but as it were, in the very structure and syntax of his writing. And so to see what maybe means, let's consider Clare's poem, Wood Pictures in the Winter, which is an evocation of a landscape where every element is interlinked. And he writes, the woodland swamps with mosses verified and bulrush forests bowing by the side of shagroot sallows that snug shelter make for the coy moorhen in her bushy lake, into whose tide a little runnel weaves such charms for silence through the choking leaves, and wimpling melodies that but intrude as lullabies to ancient solitude. And you can hear the way he builds up that sense of interdependence between humanity and nature with a whole string of conjunctions and subclauses that pile up one on the other, capturing, to quote maybe again, the sense that the woodland swamp is not a static landscape, but a living ecosystem connected by the movement and the mutual usefulness of all of its components. For John Clare, in other words, there's no separation of an animal or plant from its living context. They are one. Imagine for a moment just how transformative it would be if we were to bring that same attitude and approach and appreciation of our interdependence with nature out of the verses of poetry and into our whole way of approaching politics and society. And by way of an example, actually, some of this is beginning to happen. There's a wonderful organisation called Lawyers for Nature, and they've got a campaign running right now, which is to campaign for dictionaries, starting with the Oxford English Dictionary, to change their definition of nature. Because if you look at the primary definition of nature in the OED, it talks about plants and animals as separate from human beings, and it's very explicit that it's not us. And their campaign is to get that changed so that nature is defined to include human beings as well as the other species that we are so privileged to share this precious planet with. And another good place to start, I think, would be to recognise the fundamental rights of nature itself. And there is, again, a growing movement, both in the UK and worldwide, to do just that with a new legal framework for nature's rights. Last year, for example, following a groundbreaking motion, I'm pleased to say, from Green Party councillors, Lewes District Council became the first council in the country to recognise the rights of rivers. In this case, the right of their River Ouse, a separate one from the one in Northamptonshire. That confused me for a while, but it's a separate one. River Ouse in East Sussex, it protects the right of that river to flow free from pollution. And I think we need to see such commitments to our natural world being made on a national level with a new National Manifesto for Nature, or as the Greens have proposed, a new Rights of Nature Act, with an independent commission for nature to oversee its enforcement. And so you would never again have water companies deciding that it actually made financial sense for them to pollute the water that we drink rather than actually to clean it up. We would make sure that they would face such sanctions for that it would not be in their interests. And the reason for doing that, I think, would come from an understanding that a commitment to the well-being of England's nature is just as much a commitment to the well-being of its people. The damage done to our environment can't be divorced from the damage done to the people who are part of it. When our air is polluted, for example, our lungs are damaged too, with thousands dying early deaths. When our water is contaminated with chemicals and microplastics and sewage, so too are our bodies. When our environment has no rights or protections, then we lose out as well. And nor do most of our politicians, sadly, even promise them today. At a time when nature is in crisis, when the climate emergency is unfolding in front of our eyes, you might think that the political parties, the main ones running for election, would bend over backwards to literally promise voters the earth. But it's not a healthy planet that most of them are offering. They continue to promise voters that they are the party that will restore economic growth, not the natural world, as if that in itself were the ultimate goal. Too often they define prosperity, not in terms of our health and well-being, or that of the environment around us, but by this unending quest for GDP growth, growth in gross domestic product. It has become an overriding and all-consuming and all-destroying national obsession. So in the name of GDP growth, we allow fossil fuel companies to keep pumping planet-wrecking oil and gas. We allow those water companies I've spoken about to dump their sewage and pay their fines because it's cheaper than to invest in proper treatment. We allow developers to destroy irreplaceable habitats if they replace it with so-called better habitat elsewhere, a so-called biodiversity net gain, which far too often is simply a confidence trick. And not only do we allow those violations to happen, we even quite often call it progress. We disguise and forgive all manner of ills, lost species, lost habitats, polluted air, land and seas, all in a haze of trade-offs and cost-benefit analyses. So it seems to me that as a society, we urgently need to find new ways to dismantle that corrosive mentality that sets economic growth as the preeminent goal, which has become so deeply entrenched in UK policy and decision-making. Because only if we can change our mindset and see how inextricably our own well-being is linked to and dependent on our natural environment, only if we can acknowledge that we are part of nature, not separate from it, and only if we recognise the inalienable rights that nature possesses and fight to uphold them, will we be able to rise to those existential threats of our time, the climate and nature emergencies. And so, in conclusion, this radical re-envisaging of the very foundations of our relationship with nature requires us, I think, to tell a different story of another England. Because a country without a coherent story about who and what it is can never thrive and prosper. The inequitable power structures and the landed interests of England's past will not protect and secure England's future, and nor will our broken political system be able to fix our broken planet. But post-Brexit, in a society characterised by so many ideological tensions and divisions whipped up by a populist government, what could perhaps make all the difference is starting to tell fresh and inclusive stories about England and Englishness, not the stories of exceptionalism or imperial nostalgia, not blathering on about everything about England being world-beating, but perhaps one thing that does have the power to unite people across regions and generations is the power of our connection to that green and pleasant land, that love of nature, which has been part of our culture and our literary tradition for centuries. Now more than ever, I think, we need to bring that back. Not in the manner of Cooper, sitting on our logs, lamenting the past glories of the English countryside, but as John Clare would have had us done, in connection with nature, understanding that fundamental truth, that the natural world is an intrinsic and inextricable part of who we are, both as individuals and as a nation. And if we can find and tell the stories that speak to that truth and inspire us to imagine and strive towards new and better futures, that then, I think, could well prove to be one of the most transformative acts that we could ever undertake. Thank you. Just a moment. I don't think I should have done that. Hang on. Forgot that was in my pocket. Sorry. Okay.
So, Caroline, thank you very much. That was hard-hitting, clear, not that chirpy until the slightly more upbeat end, but thank you very much. But underlying that message, there's a provocation to us all, which comes out more clearly in the book. Caroline's on tour starting a conversation, and it's a conversation I think she would like to pass on to you, and that is the question, what does it mean to be English? It's a very difficult question, and the provocation we're given in the book is that the political right has hijacked the narratives of what it means to be English. The left has largely failed to keep up. The better storytellers belong to the political right. The jokers, the comedians, the people who can tell a good story. And the left has failed to galvanize that attention. That's the argument, in essence, underlying, I think, the lecture, the question, another England is possible. There's another way of conceptualizing. That's all right. Another way of conceptualizing the way in which we tell stories. The book takes us through a tour of literature and landscape, looking at examples of other kinds of stories, other ways of thinking about identity, people, and the relationship between us and the country. So I suppose my first question, given the provocation, is who have you written this book for, and what would you like to happen?
So I have written this book for, mostly I guess it is aimed at people on the centre and the left, because it feels to me that it's us, me I should say, I'd have no idea where you're from, but the people that I know of on the left and the centre left haven't just failed to tell compelling stories, they haven't even tried. I mean, we're not even on the pitch. And that I just think really matters, because storytelling is such a vital way of making sense of who we are and who we want to be and where we're going. And to the extent that, we've let that be really, as you say, hijacked by the right, then we're losing a really important way of communicating with people and hopefully mobilizing them behind a rather different agenda. And so, for example, you've got, Brexit, of course, is the case in point. But when you've got the kind of jingoistic, England or whatever can go it alone, and, the Battle of Britain might be prayed in aid on the side of people on the right, I think it is worth pointing out that 1 in 10 of those RAF pilots who took part in the Battle of Britain were refugees from Nazi Europe. So we've had this tradition of being a much more inclusive country, a much more welcoming country than, sadly, we are today. And so if we can construct a bit more of that story, I think then it might be able to give us more confidence and more inspiration to be able to communicate that more widely and remind people that we have a far more inclusive and progressive heritage than those of, Boris Johnson and others might like us to think.
Thank you. So I really have been provoked into thinking hard about the message in the book. And I'm an anthropologist. I like telling stories. And I was trying to think of what it was in the stories of the political right that make them land so effectively. And it occurred to me that they're largely open-ended and inconclusive and impossible to achieve. In infinite growth, a lost age, a kind of imperialism. Whereas the stories you're driving at and trying to encourage us to think through the levelers, the Chartists and things like that, they're rather more true in a way. So Rory Stewart asked you a similar question. He called this a structural problem. You didn't know what Rory Stewart meant, or it was a very bad question. He'd not phrased it properly. So as a skilled politician, you didn't answer the question. But what I suppose he was trying to get at, and I'm trying to get at as an anthropologist, is to think about the conditions and the frames that people on the political left and the political right have to tell stories that make those things qualitatively different. And I wonder whether your ask of the political left isn't actually really a tough thing to want to do, to take those stories and to make them land and to give them life and to galvanize communities and change. So I wondered, just to help me and to help the audience, if you could give an example of the kind of story that you had in mind.
Well, let me just sort of begin to unpack a little bit of that, because you say it's not easy. No, maybe it's not easy, but it's certainly perfectly possible. And the first place we should start is by not echoing the frame of the people that we might be wanting to distance ourselves from. So, for example, taxation, the tax burden. Why on earth do people on the left talk about the tax burden? It's not a burden. Tax is actually something where we come together collectively to invest in those things that individually we can't do. And so, yes, we can have a conversation about whether or not taxation in this country is as fair as it should be, and that might take us into all kinds of interesting places around a wealth tax and taxes on assets, not just on income. But if the very first thing we should stop doing is repeating the frame. And that comes, with climate as well. And it feels to me that the story that the right is telling about climate change is that, it's all sorts of things, isn't it? But it's far too expensive to do anything about. That it's not our problem, it's China's in any case. And all those people who want to see a better environment are all kind of muesli-eating, wokerati Guardian readers. And which may some of it be true, but anyway. But the point being that the story to tell about climate change is that this is the most extraordinary opportunity as well as a threat. It is an opportunity for us to invest in the green economy, which would, for example, make people's homes far more energy efficient. It would get their fuel bills down. It would create jobs, and it might just be a spur to help us to reimagine our relationship with the natural world. So that's probably not the sort of story that you were thinking of, but just trying to make something contemporary to be able to help us to make those kinds of connections and to just to notice the stories that are being told, because sometimes it just kind of comes through the ether and it gets repeated by the broadcasters, and before you know it, there's something that is deemed to be true rather than actually something that people are inquiring into, challenging, and then positing a different kind of narrative.
Thank you.
You don't look convinced.
I think it's so hard, and I suppose I find myself thinking I've understood what you mean 1 minute, and then the next minute it's just gone from my grasp, and I've been feeling like that for a couple of days. And I was hoping there'd be a resolution in this conversation.
I mean, maybe reframe your question, but I'm
Fantastic. So moving on, rather than reframing my own question, in the book you take us through a route that will be familiar to some people in this room through the work of Benedict Anderson and imagined communities and nations into the myths of Robin Hood, and show wonderfully that Robin Hood, the story changes over time depending on who's in power. Robin Hood changes character, takes on different characteristics, and so on. And I think that's a really wonderful example of the ways in which the stories about England have changed and don't have that immemorial sort of quality, and they are really dynamic sorts of stories. You also show, I think, that the future is not, for England, is not in the stories of the bumbling right, or in the stories of, as you just said, the wokerati of the Guardian subscription list. So I suppose my question, and the last substantial question I have, is where do you see the true England, the voices of the true England, which is a phrase that you use towards the end of the book? Who are they? Who is that true England? And I know it's very difficult to pick out odd phrases from a book of a few hundred pages long, but I'd imagined you deliberated on the use of that phrase because it stands out quite strongly and quite clearly.
Just trying to remember where it is in the book.
236.
Okay, fine, thank you. Check it in a moment. I mean, what I think I'm trying to do in the book is to not posit another truth, to say that the story of the right is the one that I'm challenging, and I'm saying there are lots of other stories. And what I don't want to do is to pretend that I've got one story off the shelf that I'm going to posit as the one that is going to challenge the one on the right, because that's not what it's about. There are as many different stories of England as there are people who are there to define it and to tell those stories. So all I want to do is to try to encourage all of us to try to find those more inclusive stories of England, and to, for example, celebrate the fact that some of the more progressive movements that we have today, whether that's the movement around land reform or Black Lives Matter, actually have quite a long history, and we can trace some of that back. And so maybe to try and answer the question that you don't think I answered earlier about stories. And I mean, another story there is around The Tempest, and I use Shakespeare's Tempest to talk about the fact that opposition to empire and to slavery is not something new. You know, at the very time when some of those ships were sailing off to the Barbados and so forth, they were the story that Shakespeare was taking on was absolutely to say it's not great to just suddenly show up on someone else's island and stick a flag in it and say this belongs to us now. And you know, there are plenty of readings of Shakespeare that would show you that in The Tempest and elsewhere. So what I want to do is to construct some of these stories. They're known. I'm not coming across things that aren't there, but that people don't, you know, that they are there for the finding if we sew them together, if we link them together, if we make a narrative out of them. And so it's not saying this is true England and that isn't. It's about many stories of England, but then towards the end of the book, what it's about as well is about the constitutional changes that we're going to need to see in order to have a chance of that England being able to flourish. And that's when we get into the written constitution and the fairer voting system and all the rest of it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll open the floor to questions in a minute, and while you're collecting your thoughts, I have, if you don't mind, Caroline, 5 quickish fire questions that require 1 or 2 or maybe a sentence length kind of answers. And the first one is George Monbiot or Richard Mabey?
I think it's quite an unfair question. But I will go with George Monbiot because I think he's done so much to really kind of get the message out there in a popular way that I think people relate to. But it's hard.
And he was fantastic in this lecture theatre last year as well.
I bet he was.
The second quick-fire question is Lord of the Flies or Lord of the Rings?
That one's an easy one. I'll go with Lord of the Rings.
Okay. In the book, at the beginning, you say that Rishi Sunak's time in office has been pointless.
And that's polite, frankly.
Almost writing about it as if it were in the past tense already.
Funny.
So will Rishi still be in number 10 by Christmas?
No, he won't. And the smell of decay, I promise you, as you walk through the corridors of Parliament is overwhelming.
A slightly harder one, maybe in a yes or a no. Does the union have a future?
I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I think there are pros and cons. But we can discuss those.
Thank you. And then finally from me, have you ever been tempted to join the Labour Party to pursue green politics?
No. I mean, I say no. I mean, obviously, I do. I mean, to be serious, one spends a lot of time thinking about how can one be as effective as possible in terms of bringing about change. And of course, I absolutely respect people who do join the Labour Party to do that. But it just feels to me that as well as having good people in the Labour Party pushing from the inside, we do need strong people on the outside pushing them to be bolder and braver. And that's the choice that I've made. But and I don't doubt that. But I am not saying that those people who are inside the Labour Party trying to push it is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. But please vote Green.
So, Lancaster's in a wonderful part of England. We have Morecambe Bay to one side, the Forest of Bowland to the other. I look around the room and I can see people who are storytellers who bring together landscape and identity in their work and their writing. For the storytellers in the room, I'd ask you to keep your questions sharp. And for all others, please ask Caroline questions. Yeah.
You are, as ever, you're a joy to listen to, and you've been an inspiration. But I've got to ask the question, aren't we doing what the left does, which is to sit around and talk about poetry and Shakespeare and telling a better story, and meanwhile the right do what they do, which is to make everything sound clear and simple and all about money. And what I want to say to you is, do you think we've got time for this? We've just had the hottest year ever. We've got droughts, we've got crop failure, we passed 1.5 last year. Have we got time to sit around talking about poetry and putting on a GCSE in natural history?
Yeah.
Have we got time?
Yes. I mean, I totally get where you're coming from. Obviously, I spent my whole life trying to accelerate action on the climate emergency, trying to get the government to stop its latest obscenity in terms of what it's doing to the natural world. I know how urgent this is. But what I've also tried to ask myself is, given that it's not evidence that we lack, given that it's not money that we lack, given that it's not technical knowledge that we lack, it is political will that we lack, what is it that can generate that political will? Why is it that when people are on the doorstep, they're not necessarily raising the climate or nature? That's what I hear from other MPs when they say why they're not taking that up in Parliament. And so it feels to me that actually how we communicate with one another is massively important. And I don't think that's a distraction. I can see why you might think it is, and I'm not suggesting we all just go and have a nice, poetry session and don't use that. But let's use it. I mean, we could also nourish our souls as well, which is probably quite useful because it's a long slog ahead. But I do passionately believe that how we communicate is really important. And part of that communication, of course, is through the political process and through writing party manifestos. But, one of the ways that I think I've had quite a bit of impact was actually when I was asked to curate an art exhibition at the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne. And I chose to do it on climate change, predictably. But I did it through looking at paintings that was in their back catalogue of the changing coastline of Sussex and what was happening with erosion. And you can reach different people in different ways. I passionately believe the arts can reach people and speak to their hearts in a way that politicians can only dream of. Politicians have failed. We've still got to get better, and we still need to get Greens in there, and the political system needs to be a hell of a lot better than it is. But the arts have got a massive role to play as well. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do in this book is to bring those two things together. But it's not to say it's not urgent. It's because it's urgent that I think we need to be exploring every single avenue that we have to try to communicate, to build that political will and to make that change happen.
So we have a question on the far left.
Can I have my assistant? I've never met that man before, but he's quite right. My question goes back to the previous one, and I want to return to a phrase that you used, which is no one has a legal right to live in clean air or protect nature. But I was thinking that's not quite true, and if we look into other jurisdictions, we have organisations like Client Earth, and we have organisations like the amazing Klimasignorinen from Switzerland, who have just taken the Swiss government to court through the European Court of Human Rights. So one of my questions to you is how can we also use that kind of legal identity? It is 1215, it is 1217 of England, to make real and active legal strides, because we're also seeing legal systems being used to close down protests. So Greenpeace is suing Shell. So I wondered why you hadn't included that kind of legal England and that kind of legal process as part of a form of activism.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's what I outline in the book, and what I think I said in the speech was about expanding that legal system to make sure that there are more rights that can be defended through the courts. But, if you have to do it through the courts, then that's a very slow and expensive way of doing it. And thank God there are people out there like the Good Law Project and others, or the Client Earth, who will do it. But it seems to me as well that the law is part of it, but it's also about enshrining it in our political system so that we know straight away that if certain pollution or damage is done, then the legal consequences of that are entirely clear straight away, rather than relying on quite a lot of making law as we go along in order to build up that precedent of case law. So I do think the courts have got a massive role to play, and it's exactly where a lot of the action is moving right now. I mean, on a very different subject, just this week we've been talking about the Rwanda bill in Parliament. And yes, we've come to the end, sadly, of the legal road, of the legislative road on that. But now, thanks to some of the court cases, we're going to have another bite at the cherry of seeing if we can use the courts to do that. But let's enshrine that better.
Thank you. There's a question over here, third row along. This gentleman was very critical of George Monbiot last year.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks for the warning.
So you talk a lot about the way that the English are supposed to love nature. You talked earlier about that. Now, one of the problem is we talk about loving nature in the way we might talk about loving a person, which is often really a projection of our needs and fantasies about somebody. It might be better to drop the word love here and to appreciate nature and all its kind of, the environment rather, I don't like the word nature, in all its kind of complexity and unknowability and darkness, and stop talking about love all the time.
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I can see where you're coming from, but I'm not sure that I agree with you. I mean, I don't like the word environment, are you a lover of the word biodiversity as well? I mean, because it's... no, okay. Do you appreciate the word biodiversity as well? Because a lot of people think it's a washing up liquid or something, but it's... I like to talk about nature, I like to talk about the natural world, and I like to talk about loving it, because I do believe what Richard Louv said, that we won't protect what we don't love, and I think... I don't have a problem with that, which is not to say that it's like some cuddly bear that is not unknowable. It is very unknowable, and nature can be pretty damn fierce as well when it's when we have these incredible storms and or if you're in the sea and the waves take you and so forth. So it's not, loving something doesn't have to be tame. I think you can love something in a very wild way. Look at Emily Bronte. Sorry, but I mean, come on, let's get out there on the moors. That's love as well.
Okay, there was a question in the middle here somewhere and I've lost the hand. Okay, let's go over to this. You're on that side, so let's go up there to the gentleman with the grey T-shirt, and then we'll come down to you.
Good. I'd appreciate you talking a little bit more about values, because it seems to me that our actions are driven by our immediate needs, but our desires are driven by our values. So all these rich people and rich corporations, their value is to have more wealth, and that means more monetary wealth, more power. For the rest of us, quite a bit of our values, we value having lots of stuff. And it seems to me that to sort of change the dialogue, we need to find a way of getting deeper into thinking about people adopting different values and valuing the sort of things you've been talking about: the clean water, the nature, the biodiversity, and so on.
I mean, I think most people do value those things, and they certainly value their kids and a safe future for their kids and so forth. So I think in a way it's about how some political leaders and politicians kind of try to abuse that in some way, or not abuse it, but try and play on it in a way that's unhelpful. So, I mean, I think lots of our values, which are mostly around, wanting to do good by our families and generally speaking, to do good by each other, I think those are basically where most people are coming from. It's just then that you have, messages from a government, for example, that will tell you that the reason that your dad or your mum can't get their hip replaced is because there are too many migrants in front of them in the queue. Seriously, that is what they will say. And so then what they're trying to do is to play on your values in a very unhelpful and untruthful way. Whereas what I would want us to do is to recognize from that same set of values, which is about appreciating others and understanding where they're coming from, recognizing that actually the migrants that are in question are the ones who are treating you on your emergency table in the A&E, rather than the ones who are standing in front of you in the queue. So I'm not sure how far the debate about trying to instill different values goes. My starting point would be more that I think most people, not all, and Suella Braverman is in a case of her own on this question, but most people, I think, have broadly speaking values that we can relate to and that are positive.
Okay, I can
That's
see
got a lot of hands up now.
lots and lots of hands, but I'm afraid we probably only have time for 2 more questions, and this gentleman has been very patient so far. Thank you for waiting.
Okay. I wanted to talk about inclusivity. And,
where are you? Oh, yes. Sorry. Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, that doesn't make me a lefty, by the way. I wanted to talk about inclusivity under the label English, because I've always thought of myself primarily as a Cumbrian, secondly as a Briton, and a long way third as English, because when you look at the relationship of the north of England with the south, William the Conqueror came north from England, although he was French, and laid waste to the north. Henry VIII came north from England and laid waste to the north. Margaret Thatcher sent other people to lay waste to the north. And I think that has made a swathe of people from the Mersey to the Humber a little bit dubious about this label English. Even Robin Hood only tiptoed across the Humber to die in Selby. So, do you have any comment on it's not homogenous, this label English?
I would absolutely agree with you, and I make the point in the book very, very clearly that it is not homogenous. It is extremely diverse, and there are very many different Englands. And I absolutely am not suggesting that you take away any of those identities that you've listed there, and lots of people have a real passion for the place they're from, whether that's Cumbria or Cornwall or wherever. I suppose I'm just saying that I think that there's a worry if we completely forget about downgrade and don't want to go to the England bit of it, partly because England might be what we're left with if Scotland does become independent, if the island of Ireland reunites, and so forth. And therefore, what sort of country do we want this to be? What I would love to see that country be is a country with massive devolved powers. So in Cumbria, you've got far more powers than you currently have at the moment. We're one of the most centralised countries in the Western world. So it seems to me, rather than just not engaging with it, all I'm asking is, as well as your British identity and your Cumbrian identity and so on, we think a bit about how could we become proud of an English identity in there as well, because we might well need it. And I'd far rather that all of us had a chance in defining what that looked like, rather than Kemi Badenoch or Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Okay, we have time for one more hand. Yes, the lady in black. Yeah, here comes the microphone.
Could I just ask what you think is the biggest barrier to climate change, to us resolving the problems? Because I remember 20, 30 years ago, when climate change was brought up and I was a youngster, and at that time I thought, well, surely the politicians will respond to this, because it was quite a horrendous sort of story of what can happen if they don't resolve the problem, but nothing really seems to have happened much. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, what do you think is the one biggest thing that is creating the barrier to change?
Well, vested interests, I guess, and I think we've underestimated them for decades. And, for those interests that want to go on extracting oil and gas from the North Sea, they are incredibly well connected, and they meet very, very regularly with government. And some of the parliamentary questions that I've asked and some of the freedom of information requests that others have put in demonstrate just how much access those oil and gas companies have with ministers on an almost daily basis. And you compare that to the voices that they hear or don't hear from, whether that's the renewable energy companies or whether it's from people who are just wanting to have a safe future. So I think we've massively underestimated the fact that we might have thought that once objective facts were put in front of people in power, that they would see the writing on the wall and they would do the right thing. And I think we've massively underestimated just for how long the right, with all of their think tanks and all of the organisations around them, have had an interest in doing the opposite, because it pays them financially to do that. If you add into that a right-wing media in the hands of a very tiny minority who also have their axe to grind, you have something like the Telegraph, which is spouting out climate lies on a daily basis, and yet that's one of our main broadsheets in this country. Then it's not surprising, maybe, that we haven't made the progress that we need to. Well, we do need to address the massive media monopolies, and we do need to address the fact that the right are incredibly well organised and the vested interests are absolutely right inside government. But for most people, that's quite a hard ask in terms of really, really engaging with that. And so I think we also need to be just making the case over and again that something as basic, which this government has singularly failed to put in place as a street-by-street home insulation programme, could make a hell of a lot of difference. Why are we so incapable of having done that? It would get, as I said before, fuel bills down, it would get jobs created, it would get emissions down as well. So we've had a government that seems incapable or unwilling to have done even the most basic stuff. So as well as campaigning on some of these big things, like media concentration or like the vested interests in government, then I think there are some kind of, hopefully, some easier wins along the way that we can push back on those voices that are saying that somehow tackling the climate crisis is all about shivering around a candle in a cave, whereas in fact, tackling the climate crisis is a way to get us off dependence on costly oil and gas. It's the way to get our fuel bills down. It's the way to get our local communities thriving again.
Okay, I'm going to apologise to... So I'm going to apologise to all frustrated hands in the room, including my own wife, who even winked at me while putting a hand up and invite Bill to come and thank Caroline and to thank you for attending this evening.
Thanks, Ed. Well, thank you, Caroline, for a terrific lecture. Ed, for your very light touch moderation, and you, the audience, for being here and for your very good questions. I have three small things to say before we bring the event to an end. The first is, please do write to us at info@litfest.org and tell us what you thought about the event and also what you think about Litfest events generally. The second thing is to say that Caroline's book, which she referred to, Another England, is on sale outside. Now, the book costs £22. If you buy it on Amazon, you can buy it for £18, but by the time you've paid the postage, you're back at £22. If you buy it from Litfest tonight, you pay £18, you get the book, no postage, and you take it home. So it's what they call a no-brainer, I think. And the last thing to say is Litfest works in collaboration with a great range of partners in and around Lancaster, the university being one of them. And we are enormously grateful to those partnerships, Lancaster Arts, for example, being another. We also receive some of our funding from the Arts Council as well as from NLHF, from Lancaster City Council, and small grants from local foundations. But a hugely important part of what allows us to do this work and this varied work, from taking school children to RSPB Leighton Moss, or taking philosophers into schools or doing poetry workshops, as well as the events we do, it depends on ticket income and donations. And this year we've chosen not to charge or to recommend a price of £5 a ticket, but to say pay what you can, because everyone's having a tough time at the moment. But we rely on those who can to donate. So on your way out, before you buy the book, please donate to Litfest, and we'll be back again with many more interesting and challenging and enjoyable events. But the most important thing tonight is to say thank you to Caroline Lucas for the third Lancaster Environment Lecture. Thank you very much.